if you look at this image over here on the right-hand side, this is what I was talking about. In Asian societies, though they do it differently, because you have to remember Asian societies are very, very different cultures. They share some common logics, but how Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans see things, for example, is just radically different from one to the other. And the way they express it is pretty radically different. But Japanese is one fair number of people, especially here in Hawaii, are familiar with. And it's also one of the ones most visually recorded. So it's easy to, for example, do a search like this and find this image. In Asian societies, what you find is there's a very strong sense that there's a complete distinct break between the outside world and the inside world. In the Japanese home use residence, you see this in the idea of the Japanese entry, the genkan, the foyer or entry place. And here's just a nice little image that shows you this. So on this side out here is your outside world. And you come in here and you've got this tiled area, and very little would be paved differently. It might be paved in concrete with stones inset. There's a gazillion different ways to do it. But the key here is this area will be lower. There'll be a step here. Now you see this not only in Japanese homes, but in all the Japanese spaces. The only place you don't see it necessarily is in restaurants. But for example, Japanese temples or other ritual places or important places will invariably have some sort of a barrier. Now the Chinese do the same thing. They just don't bother with the raised up thing. But in both these cultures, what happens is from outside moving into inside, you have to pick your feet up off the ground. Now the Japanese sort of, very cleverly just sort of do the whole thing where you actually switch, for example, your shoes, for example, from one to the other. In Chinese society, if it's a ritual site, like say a temple, you don't take your shoes off, but you still pick your feet up, go over a beam, which is oftentimes, 3 or 4 inches high, and then put your feet down on the other side. So your feet leave the ground outside of the temple, go over a barrier, and then put the feet back on the ground inside the temple. Japanese do the same thing in temples in that regard, since they're based on a Chinese model largely. So what you get here is the idea that the outside world is totally different than the inside world. The closest analogy I can think of from Western context would be if you're in a spacecraft and you're in outer space and you go through an airlock and then you're inside the spaceship or space station or whatever. That would be the closest analogy, where the two is seen as radically, radically different. And you need to have an intermediate zone in which you negotiate outside the inside. Now, of course, when you're leaving the house and you're leaving the inside here, you come up here, you go into this, again, airlock or intermediate zone, you put your shoes on, then boom, you go out into the outside world. Here's a different image, same exact thing. So, and you see this here in Hawaii because we tend to do this, you leave your slippers off, you take your shoes and slippers off when you come in the house. And that's, of course, from the Asian model, the Japanese, Chinese, etc. We don't necessarily do the raised areas anymore. In that regard, it's become sort of an American where it's sort of the ritual of doing it. And I think probably because of, disability and other types of issues, you're not going to find the blocks where you have to lift up and go over to move from one area to the next. But this idea of a transition zone, that one's radically different than the other, is typical in Asian design. Again, Japanese have some, very sort of succinct, useful terms that if you ever get involved in Asian design, you'll hear a lot. But the way they actually have this in a very clear conceptual way, what I just mentioned, and they have this idea of Tatemae, or the public, the social, the outdoor, the world. But it also has, in a very interesting way, the fact that in the Japanese concept, this is true both in Korea and China, that the way that you act in public is in many cases completely different and follows completely different social, behavioral, etc. rules than the way you act in what you might call private. So they did public and private. No, they're both group-based versus the American, which is sort of in privacy in the sense of impersonal. Is very much the idea that their package. But the key here is they're saying it's distinctly different. Tatemae is different than Honne. They're different things. And this is reflected in the physical world in the fact that you have different places you do these things. And these places are actually demarked differently. There's no intermediate zone. In the American situation, you have the idea of the outside world, you have the idea of the home, But Americans frequently have parties in their house. They invite people in their house, maybe they use the backyard or whatever. But there's sort of a continuum of use from the outside to the inside, or from the public to the private. And it's very complicated or very confusing for Asians, for example, on how Americans use their homes, because in many ways their homes seem to be public space, and it's certainly true. I think there's certain truth in that. By contrast, in the Asian system, for example, in China and Japan, very rarely would people ever get invited over to your house. It's in Japan, unless folks are very westernized, it's almost unheard of. And in China, it'd be very, I can't think of a situation where if you're not family, when you'd be in someone's house. It just doesn't make any sense. So the idea of outside and inside is very much two discrete, separate things. There's nothing linking them together, except that in the Japanese sense, the genkan, where you transit from or to transition from one to the other. But that transition zone is very, very small and very short and very sort of ephemeral. And its main function is to warn you that you're leaving one for the other. So if you're in the house, if you're in your private zone, which would be the family space, people are expected to act in entirely different ways than they do in the public space, which would be anything other than the house. And so in that context, when you're leaving this home space for the world space, you have to be reminded that you're going to a place where all the rules are different. The social rules are different. The etiquette rules are different. Everything's different. And so you're getting this sort of, flashing red light warning that you're moving from this to that. And that's why you have the leaving the genkan, going through a different physical space, stepping down or stepping over, and boom, you're in the public. Likewise, coming home, you're leaving the public or outside world. I'm coming over through that liminal area in between and then coming to the inside world. Now, in the Asian tradition, one reason you lift the feet up is the outside world is seen as polluted. There's all sorts of things outside. There's, if in Japanese, there's kami, there's spirits, there's things that attach you to you. There's dirt, there's contagion, there's all this type of stuff that exists in the outside world. And you want to make sure you don't bring that into the inside world. And so that's one of the main functions of the genkan. It would almost be like a decontamination chamber, if you think. And likewise, when you're leaving the inside area, you have to sort of bundle yourself up, because now you're going into the outside world. So one of the things that you would see typically in, say, Japan in 2022, and that's certainly true in China, is you'd find that the people would have, an area set aside where they would have masks, so that you put a mask on because you're going outside. To a certain extent, I think this is one reason, this might be at least in part one reason why in Asia, the idea of wearing a mask in public doesn't have a lot of the same social connotations that it does in the Western or American world, simply due to the fact that they already have a very strong concept that the outside is different than the inside. And so the behavioral social rules in one place really don't extend to the other. And along with that, the outside world is seen as very dangerous. It's random, it's unpredictable, it's contagious, so you can get sick in it. So for example, if someone gets sick in the house, it's invariably assumed they got it from outside. And so the idea of, for example, wearing a mask or dressing differently because you're outside is just sort of part of the logic. People see in the world around them. Now, going back to the virtual stuff, the interesting thing about virtual worlds like, say, Second Life is when people are building their residences, they very frequently have it set up so that you can't access it. So you can actually build a digital fence in Second Life, and they're very, very common. And it's sort of interesting that in Second Life 1, you'll see that people will actually fence off their residential areas, which means to have some sort of concept of outside and inside. But even more importantly, as you could argue in some ways, for a lot of folks, I think this is especially be true of Americans, but certainly with other groups, say Asians, if you're in Second Life, because one, it's anonymous, two, it's adults, and so three, you don't know who those adults are. And some way you're not actually in the outside world. You're not really you. So you don't have the wrist attached that you would, because one of the huge aspects of Tatemae in Japanese society is that people will know who you are. So if you act or dress or otherwise are inappropriate in public, people know who to diss on. Unlike social media, where you can have 20 social media accounts, and in some cases, in many cases, people will know who it actually is. They'll just get pissed off at who the account is, but not the actual person behind it. In the real world in Asia, if you're in public, people know who you are. And so there's huge social consequences to not following the rules in public, which is why Tatemae is such a a huge issue in Japanese society. People go to such huge constraints to follow it, or in some cases to intentionally sort of mildly poke it with a stick for reasons that we don't have time to get into in this class. But if you think about it in a virtual world like Second Life, where anonymity is absolutely central, then you never have the outside world. So to a certain extent, for Asians in Second Life, one of the things you might be able to sort of assume, or at least logic out, is in some ways Second Life allows them to be in a public realm where they can actually express aspects of themselves that they do not really have the ability to do in Japan, China, or Korea, because you don't ever use one in the Tatemae world. And you're very careful how much of Tatemae you bring into your one world. They're very discrete, different things. And so for a virtual world, it's a really handy set of concepts in terms of public and private in a very conceptualized way that's actually related to the physical use of space and the built environment. The other one that's really key with a lot of this is that in Asian systems, Chinese don't have this manifest in a particular term the way the Japanese do. And my Korean I don't have access to Korean in many ways, so I don't really understand if they have it, though I suspect they do. In Japanese society, there's this term ikigai, which is a really fascinating term. It really doesn't translate into English at all. And the definition I have here is as good as any, that self-identity is largely based on an internal sense of self. This is very, very key in much of Asian social logic. People's sense of who they are is in large part built upon their own constructs, their own self-assessments as they go through life. Now, for most, Asians, by the time they're in their teens, their ikigai has already been pretty much structured. But the key here is it's not based on external stimulus. So ikigai in Japanese society is based on how someone builds up their sense of self-identity. Now, it's based in part on input from outside, but it's also got a huge proportion of it that people basically build their sense of self-identity from their internalized sense of self. So it's what we call internalized self-identity. By contrast, Americans are almost entirely, I would argue, externalized self-identity. Americans live in a world where basically we constantly are being judged. We judge others, and our sense of worth is based on the scores we get. The number of likes we get in our social media accounts and such like that. How many people diss on our Instagram or Snapchat accounts, and that has a huge emotional social impact to us because we are very public, and we present ourselves in public, and our sense of self-identity is very much based on how others see us. So this is what we call an externalized sense of self. In Asia, what you find is much more internalized sense of self. Now, it's played out entirely different between Japanese, Koreans, and Chinese in terms of how they do this. But they do have in common this sense of self-identity is very much internalized. In other words, built within the self, and is somewhat more durable to outsized critique. They're also more vulnerable, for example, if their internal sense of self does get questioned, because you can't go and ask someone to help you. Obviously, if you built it yourself, then it's your problem if it starts to fall apart. An externalized sense of self is why you have social psychologists and counseling, psych, and psychiatry, is in part due to this idea of externalized self. So you can ask for help if your sense of self-identity starts to get damaged and externalized. Someone from outside, by the external, can help you reestablish that sense of self-identity. So ikigai is the concept of how you build and the internalized, self-identity, which is really key to how Asians view themselves and how the Asian built environment functions. And it's also in large part how, in many ways, Second Life operates. Because in Second Life, people can have their own fantasy construct of who they are. No one knows who they are in the real world. No one knows where they're from in the real world. So in Second Life, they get to indulge in sort of a sense of self-identity that really isn't subject to external critique or externalized self-identity simply because they're anonymous. So this is a very useful concept. I think it's a very useful concept in terms of how people deal with social media in general. But it's especially really useful when you look at how people deal with social worlds in the sense of virtual social worlds. And we'll obviously see this again later when we get into Asian design. And to a certain extent, I'll also get into a little bit when I talk about American design or